Thanks, David.
Thank you, Zoe. Hello, hi, I'm David Hague. As Zoe said, I'm the Chairman and CEO of Brand Finance. And we have been measuring brands for over 25 years. And 4 years ago, we decided to go to Davos to release our global 500 top brands. And when we went, we thought that it was about time that we actually focused in on the role of the CEO in brand management. It's been said for many years that the CEO is the ultimate brand guardian. That's definitely true of the corporate brand, but we believe it's true of all the brands in a portfolio. And so we're looking closely at how CEOs are performing in our research. So as I said, we've done 4 different waves, and each year the number of specialists who are answering has increased. This is a particularly large sample this year. And what we're doing is asking people who actually are very familiar with the CEOs. We're not asking the general public, we're asking informed investors and analysts. And I'm very pleased to say that today we've got Punit Renjen, the global CEO of Deloitte, Hatem Dowidar, the group CEO of E&, which used to be called Etisalat, Brian Moynihan, the chair of the board and CEO of Bank of America, and Helen Edwards, who is an adjunct associate professor of marketing at London Business School, and of course, not last but not least, Annie Brown, associate at Brand Finance, who actually runs the study for us. Now, I'm keeping my comments short. I just wanted to make a couple of points which come from current affairs. The first one is, I'm sure most people have seen what's been happening to P&O in the last few weeks, where Peter Hepplethwaite, the CEO, seems to have made an absolutely catastrophic job of managing the company, presenting itself, and in the process has made a very bad effect on the P&O brand, to such an extent that the Secretary of State is actually asking that he should be struck off as a director. So a very good example of what they need to do to actually become a good CEO, managing both a good company and a brand. And it all comes down to dealing with people. I think people is the centerpiece of the CEO's role in this. That's my opinion. And I think we only need to look at the different leadership styles that are presently taking place in the ghastly war in Ukraine to see that the small underdog, because of the way Mr. Zelensky, is running his campaign, is outperforming and outgunning and outfoxing Putin. And there is no doubt that the different way in which they motivate their troops, or don't in the case of Russia, is a good example of how a CEO should really be leading his people by winning their hearts and minds and explaining what's going on and communicating well. So with that, I'm going to hand to Annie, who's going to say a bit more about the actual study itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David, and thanks again to everybody in the audience for joining today, and thank you so much to our panelists. Very excited to start that panel discussion, but just briefly before we do that, I'm just going to talk through the Brand Guardianship Index, our methodology and the key results this year. The Brand Guardianship Index is a methodology that mirrors the way that we evaluate corporate brands. It's essentially a balanced scorecard where we look at all the different attributes that we think make a good CEO in terms of how well they nourish relationships with all stakeholders and how well they manage the brand and the business, and therefore are looking after long-term sustainable value for their business. So we look at 3 different perspectives of this. We look at something called investment, which is all to do with the future direction that the CEO is taking the business in. We look at equity, which is how different stakeholders currently feel about the CEO. So as David mentioned, that's leveraging insights from our expert survey amongst analysts and journalists, as well as incorporating the views of current employees via sources such as Glassdoor. And then finally, we look at performance, and that's not just financial performance, but also how well the brand has performed over time in terms of how well the CEO has generated additional brand value and whether or not they focus on long-term sustainable value. So the 2 key sources for this study are the Brand Finance Analyst and Journalist Survey, which this year had 1,000 respondents from experienced analysts and journalists from across the world, representing over 15 key markets. And in addition, we also sourced data from the Brand Finance annual study into the world's most valuable brands. A CEO needs to perform consistently well across all of those different attributes to do well in the ranking. And that's exactly what the top 10 brand guardians this year have done. They perform consistently well across the needs that the framework highlight, and they are strong both among investors, but also amongst their internal employees. The top 10 CEOs this year have on average grown their brand value of their company by 48%. They also have an average of 96% approval rating amongst internal staff. So it's not just about how you're seen externally. Internal buy-in to the CEO is so important for company motivation and morale. And also of these top 10, half are founders of their organizations. And being a founder CEO has a really important impact on the way that the reputation of the CEO and the reputation of the brand are linked, because founder CEO's personality informs a lot of the personality of the brand as well. The other 5 in the top 10 are internal appointments. So they have spent a long time of their career working their way through the organization, building up a network of stakeholders before being appointed CEO there. So we looked at some analysis of CEO reputation score, according to the analysts and journalists in our survey, versus the average reputation of the brands in the company that they run. So that could be the average reputation of the 5 different brands that their company runs, or it could just be the reputation of the one brand that that company has, depending on the way the company is structured. And we find in general positive correlation between CEO reputation and brand reputation, but there are some outliers. So for example, you could have a CEO with a good reputation who's inherited a brand with a poor reputation and they've not yet had the ability to make their mark. Similarly, you could have a relatively weak CEO whose brands still perform well on reputation, and that really depends on the structure of the organization. So if you have a multi-branded organization with lots of different consumer brands, they're quite detached from the overall corporate brand and therefore detached from the CEO. But at the other end of the spectrum, where CEO has a really strong impact on the brand, is where it's a monolithic branded organization, and even more so when the CEO is the founder. So the most famous CEO in our study, according to the analysts and journalists, is Elon Musk of Tesla, one of the most famous founder CEOs. And he has done extremely well year on year in the study. So we've been tracking performance for a couple of years, as David mentioned. And this year we found that Elon Musk not only had very positive online coverage, he had the highest amount of net positive coverage of all the CEOs in the study, which is basically people tweeting about him or articles online talking about him in relation to Tesla, which was mostly positive and of very high volume. But also from our study, we found that his reputation has improved. And that's moved in parallel with an improvement in reputation for the Tesla brand. So amongst US consumers, we found that the Tesla brand has significantly increased its reputation year on year. And that's partially because of changing perceptions of consumers in the US and changing preferences around sustainable alternatives to fossil fuel vehicles, but also can be tied to the increase in reputation of Elon Musk. And he's done a lot over the past year to engage with the general community of the US by tweeting about things like Dogecoin, and also being quite receptive to criticisms of him and of Tesla. So he invested a lot in Bitcoin and linked that to Tesla, allowing people to in the future purchase Teslas with Bitcoin. But then there was a criticism about how does that really map to the positioning of the Tesla brand due to the sustainability concerns around Bitcoin. And he was receptive to that and divested his Bitcoin. Not great for anybody who was holding any Bitcoin at the time, because it had such a material impact on the price. But it really demonstrates that he's trying to do the right thing and trying to be perceived in a strong way, so that because of the impact he has on the Tesla brand as well. And he's furthered that recently with his support of the Ukraine armed forces by providing Starlink satellite services that's allowed the Ukraine forces to remain in communications throughout Russia's invasion. And it's quite a bizarre reality where not only that you have large corporations who are larger than some of the biggest economies in the world, but you also have heads of some of those companies who can have such a profound impact on global diplomatic relations. And what we're finding here at Brand Finance is that there's a new era of leadership, and the role of the CEO has changed profoundly today to what it was 20 years ago, and we're expecting it to continue to evolve in the future. 20 years ago, CEOs were expected to be a center of command and control, somebody who could make decisions quickly, who could absorb as much information as they could, and make decisive decisions and then act on those decisions. Today, it's more about being collaborative and gaining consensus and utilizing stakeholder capitalism. So our data suggests that today the most important drivers of CEO reputation are firstly that they're recognized as a global CEO. So having a public face for your company is increasingly important. It humanizes the organization, and there's a real opportunity for CEOs to be that public face of their organization. Secondly, having a strong strategy and long-term vision is just as important as it was 20 years ago, but arguably there's more transparency around what that means, and there's more complexity to what that means. Long-term vision isn't just about the company, it's also about the company's impact on society. And some of the other factors that have become much more important now than they were 20 years are whether the CEO is demonstrating strong social and environmental leadership, whether they're honest and ethical, are they socially responsible, these softer skills which really demonstrate stakeholder capitalism and a more collaborative approach. One of the issues that we always talk about, and is an issue in reality as well outside of our ranking, is that female representation in the CEO slot is low. And so we looked at, is there anything different about the way that the female CEOs in our study are perceived versus the way male CEOs are perceived? And in general, it's pretty consistent. There are just a few areas where female CEOs tend to outperform, and that's on having a strong strategy and long-term vision, showing an honest and ethical approach, and understanding the importance of brand and reputation for the organization. And what this really demonstrates to me is that female CEOs are just as capable as male CEOs. It could be that some of the female CEOs stand out because they have to be excellent to be in the position that they've got to. And we hope here at Brand Finance that female CEO representation will continue to rise. And I'm really excited to introduce the panel shortly because I know they're all working to increase female representation in senior positions at their organizations. If you'd like to learn more about the Brand Guardianship Index study, please have a look at the report that's been released today. It's available on our website at the link shown here. And that gives the ranking of the top 250 brand guardians, as well as the full list of the 500 CEOs that we researched. So have a look if you want to see if your CEO was included in that research, and do get in touch if you'd like to learn more. As David mentioned, we have an excellent panel joining us today. We have Punit Renjen, the global CEO of Deloitte. We have Hatem Dowidar, the group CEO of E&, which was until recently Etisalat. Brian Moynihan, the chair of the board and CEO of Bank of America, and Helen Edwards, the adjunct associate professor of marketing from London Business School. As well as hearing from the panel, we'd like to hear from the audience too. There will be audience poll questions throughout the webinar, so look out for those and do have your say. Please also feel free to populate any questions that you have through the Q&A facility, and we'll try to get to those within the time that we have. So to kick us off, Brian, if I could ask you, in your experience, what are the key attributes that you think are required to be a good steward of a corporation's reputation and brand?
Thank you, Annie. Thank you for the informative. Starting from the beginning, I think you've got to be able to listen, and both formally and informally, to all the constituencies, whether customers, shareholders, your team, and society, and so you got to have a read of what's coming at you, and we do that in great volume, and also you have to be we get it informally. So my email's in the public domain, so anybody can send me an email that works for our company or has an opinion about it. So we got that. The second thing I think is you have to be consistent to steward a brand. You have to build. Everybody talks about purpose and values and principles, but you have to be consistent to that. You can't waver back and forth, because when you have 200,000 people working for you, like we do at Bank of America, who work with 60 million consumers, the consistency is a critical thing, and so people have to understand that it's got to be long term. And Punit and I have worked a lot to define long term value creation metrics and things like that, which we can talk about, but it has to be long term by definition, because sometimes a decision you can make in the short term will be unpopular, or the stewarding will be unpopular. And then a couple other things. You have to communicate about why you're doing what you're doing, but the most important thing is communicate the why. And as a thing I've used for a long time as a way to get our team to think about it, as a manager, is a keeper of the why. You can send out what the decision is. We decided to do X. The question is why you made the decision. Actually gives the context for people to think about how that is in the context of your brand, in context of your purpose as a company, in context of how you explain it to other people. And so the communication isn't just we made a decision. The communicate is why that decision was important and what drove you to that decision, so that people can understand, how that really reflects upon your brand or on your product, services, company, and your positioning. And the last is it has to be holistic. The CEO's unique role here is they have to factor in all constituencies. So it could be a decision about a business line or a unit and they about what they're going to do, which could impact the brand. But there's only one person in the company's management team that has to think about a holistic question and represents all the constituencies. And when you have as many employees as we have, you take some of the issues that come up from time to time, we will have 50% on one side and 50% on the other side. And so you've got to remember that you represent the whole, not any part of it. And so it's a difficult positioning sometimes because you can't satisfy everybody. And so you have to be holistic in your thinking. So those are the things I'd say that I think makes for a good stewardship of a brand in a company and by the CEO of the company.
Thank you, Brian, and that's great. And I think it's a great point about you can never make everybody happy. You can never satisfy everyone, and increasingly the need to explain why you make your decisions makes that challenging. Hatem, could you potentially add anything about how you think employee expectations of CEOs have shifted recently, furthering from what Brian was commenting?
Yeah, I think what's very important is that the employees understand the importance of the brand to the outside world as well. Very consistent, both inside and outside the company. So what we project outside, it needs to very much be what we live with inside. So when we talk, and I give the example of E&, a company with a mission to bring digitalization, to bring technologies to communities we operate, all our staff need to feel the same. They need to feel that they see that value that we bring to the societies around us. They need to work against that. So it's a mixture of bringing both the higher purpose, not only achieving financial gains and getting numbers. Numbers are very important, of course, for all of us. But it's very important that they feel that their purpose is much higher. And this is what we try to communicate over and over. It's about empowerment of societies, about enablement of societies. And people need to understand that while we, of course, have an important mission towards our shareholders to bring them back returns, we also sometimes will do things that not necessarily will bring that returns, but will have a magnifying effect on our brand by really bringing a lot of value to the societies where we operate. So it's very important to keep that channel between what we do to the outside world very much connected to our staff and what we do inside the company.
And I know you're mentioning there that it's not just about one, but it's about the and I know Brian and Punit also are strong advocates of the power of and the genius of and, both purpose and profit, society and shareholders, not either or. Punit, I wonder if you could comment a bit about your thoughts on how that's evolved in recent years and how that's impacted the CEO role.
Well, I think Brian did a really nice job laying out the elements, but I'll give you an example around Deloitte. We have 350,000 professionals across the globe. 86% of them are millennials and Gen Zs. When we survey them, their number one response is, what does Deloitte do beyond its core profit motive? So it is not only the right thing to do in terms of giving back to the communities that we live and work in, it is the right business thing to do. If I want to be able to hire, retain, develop the very best individuals, I must have a credible response around what we do beyond our core profit motive for the communities that we live and work in. So it's a very clear linkage. I'd like to amplify a point that Brian made in terms of the why, but you also have to communicate the clear linkage, and maybe I have it a little easier in some respects. 15,000 partners across the globe own the firm. They come to work every day, so it's a private enterprise. I don't have to respond on a quarterly basis. But I have to convince those 15,000, we give 3% of our distributable earnings back into the communities that we live and work in. we had to convince those partners that it is good business to do that. The statistic that I just shared with you allows me to do that. And once you build that virtuous cycle, then that is easier to sustain.
And Helen, I wonder if you could comment on your perception of how this differs for different types of organizations. So in some organizations, it's easier to link purpose and profit when you have just one brand and one clear purpose, but perhaps you could explain how you think brand guardianship looks different for CEOs, depending on the brand architecture of the organization they run. So for example, the CEO of a multi-brand organization like Unilever or P&G, or even a luxury house like LVMH, is it a different role for CEOs in supporting the purpose and the brand of those organizations?
Well, I think it wasn't a surprise when you looked at your top list that many in the top were actually of a single monolithic brand, because I think it is more complicated when you are the leader of a house of brands. So even down to the complication, you know, Nestle has a 20% stake in L'Oreal, but who gets the credit for that brand guardianship? So I think it is more complicated. I think when you're a CEO of a house of brands, the role is slightly different, because I think you've got to strongly articulate the vision and coherence for investors, stakeholders, internal talent, but let the CEO of the individual brands run those brands and shine, you know, and they often are CEOs. If you take Estee Lauder, they call them CEOs of those individual brands. And then I think as the CEO of the master brand, whether it's Reckitt or Estee Lauder or Diageo, I think you've almost got to have an eye for a breach. You know, so if you're setting that vision and that coherence, you're looking out for the breach that might happen, because you have to allow the individual CEOs to flourish and shine for their individual brands.
Thank you, Helen. And please, if any of the panelists would like to add to anything another panelist has said, do feel free to incorporate that into your answers. Brian, you've been instrumental in working with the World Economic Forum to identify a set of metrics to hold companies to account on purpose and sustainability, to allow companies to report their ESG performance. Do you think a company moving forward can have a strong brand and positive reputation if they aren't reporting and disclosing ESG metrics? Is that something that's just going to become impossible moving forwards?
Well, I think you have to sort of step back to the logic of all this, which is, you know, the concepts of stakeholder capitalism are, you know, 50 plus years old, and you know, with Klaus Schwab's leadership in the West, but many other practices, for lack of a better term, that merged over the years. But you know, so it's not a new concept. But if you think about, the question was, you know, what did we mean by that, and how do you align capitalism to that? And so that's sort of one thing you have to think about. The second thing is, you know, society has spoken about what they think important is, which the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. And so what Punit and his colleagues, the other big four accounting firms with the team in our company and some other companies in the World Economic Forum's team said was, wait a second, the world knows what we want from capitalism. They just said it, 190 plus countries said it. If capitalism doesn't deliver, it isn't going to get delivered. And so because the governments don't have the money, charity is not big enough, and all the things that it's just not enough money to do the $6 trillion a year to get the SDGs in. So the question then is, can you develop a set of metrics that can prove which companies are aligned to it, and frankly, delivering on the genius of the ant? And so Punit and his colleagues went out, you know, there are millions of metric setters, maybe not literally, figuratively, with millions of metrics that everyone was just as important, question whether material. And they came up with 23 core metrics and another chunk behind them that basically went down the 4 pillars of the SDGs and have a series of metrics that say, this is our company's progress. And we put those in our annual report, as do 150 companies are committed to. I think 50 or 70 are in. And as we go through the proxy season, you'll see a bunch more across the world. Now, what does that allow the stakeholder to look at? Which is year to year, they can see the progress. So whether it's diversity inclusion and the people side, whether it's your environmental and the planet side, whether it's your governance and your tax and how you pay taxes and things like that side, or whether it's your D&I statistics, all that's on the record. So now investors have a uniform way to look across companies in an industry and across industries, not to say there's going to be one company at the top theoretically, but the question is who goes over the bar. And if you go over the bar, then that brand ought to be supported by customers. That investment ought to be supported by shareholders. That company ought to be supported by the financial communities, lending and capital markets, and it ought to be supported by the team. And so that was the idea. An alignment of metrics, align capitalism to the purpose, or else it's not going to happen. The world has told us what they want to do. Let's come up with some metrics. And it is critically important to report it, because then people who say, I do X or I do Y, you put it in your annual report and there's no debate. That's going through an audit process, and a tedious audit process and reconciliation process and data integrity process, just like our P&L is. And therefore, those numbers can be relied on by society. That's the key of putting it into the formal filings.
I'd like to add, I mean, Brian gets a lot of the credit. He led that process, and the initial work that we did was voluntary adoption around these 4 pillars that Brian talked about: people, planet, prosperity, and the principles of governance. The metrics themselves are important, but not the end result. It's the fact that people are finally recognizing that this is an important component of what they must do. And they must do this because, as Brian said, customers are demanding it, and increasingly employees are demanding it. And so it's really important, if you want to have a leading brand, that you must follow through. And so I think that Brian's leadership and the World Economic Forum and Klaus, we've got voluntary adoption. I want to give an anecdote. Brian led a session. There were about 50 CEOs on it, and I participated in that. Every one of those CEOs, from oil and gas to manufacturing, now has a commitment to be net zero by 2050 or sooner. They might not have detailed plans, but everybody is on record that they're going to be net zero. That is material progress.
And Brian, you mentioned D&I, diversity and inclusion, and I know that's something that's really important, and both that all of the panelists here are passionate about. And that too is increasingly being measured and reported across different industries, sectors, and geographies. Hatem, perhaps you could comment on what do you think is required to reach some more of the aspirational goals, such as equal numbers of women and men on boards. I know that's something that's at the forefront of the UAE growth strategy, and also really adopted by a lot of leading organizations in the United Arab Emirates.
Okay, I think, I come back one step, and I mean, commenting on what was said, I think really for any company or any brand, the same way we put the customer at the center, and the brand is about how the customer perceives the company and perceives the different brands. Part of that brand now is this whole ESG concept, whether it's the environment, the governance, and that includes everything from being an equal opportunity company to having gender equality and so on. And this is important because it also translates now into value for shareholders. So in the past, these used to be things that people just boast about in a report or in an annual report. But today, a lot of the funds, a lot of the individual investors are aware of these things. And when they are choosing which company to put their money, they look at these things. So it's now not just a nice to have, but it's essential, because if you want to be a successful company that attracts investors, that also appeals to regulators and governments when you're dealing with them, it is essential that you look at that. And I think part of, my personal experience, our market cap has increased dramatically in the past couple of years. We have almost doubled our market cap. We've now become, as a telco that's operating regionally, we've become the 7th biggest in the world in terms of market cap. And one of the reasons for this is definitely attributed to our ESG rating, which has improved beyond any other technology company that operates in the region. But we've become on par with many of the global companies, and that has made us very appealing for investors. And we have done that through different things, through, of course, making a commitment on carbon neutrality, which we have done an initial commitment that by maximum 2050, but at the moment we are working on a much more aggressive target, which we'll hopefully announce by the COP meeting later this year. We've also started changing the way our management looks like.
You know, a few years back, it was a very male-dominated management. Today, 30% of the top team are females, and we are encouraging a lot of gender equality and gender balance in hiring. So we see that in our hiring, we are at 50% or more in most of our operations. And this encourages people inside the business, but also appeals to the outside. So it has become now a very important thing, because people look at these things and it is part of the decision for them, whether they buy or they invest. They look at these aspects of a brand and they become essential.
Absolutely. And
can I just add, actually, from a, you know, I teach future talent, and I think the future talent looks for it as well. You know, the kind of what I hear from my students who I teach isn't, when we talk about the role of the CEO, it's not just about setting the strategic direction and driving shareholder return. The CEO is expected to be the moral compass, and they look for that moral compass across a range of metrics. And, you know, it's about attracting future talent, I think, as much as anything.
The one point that I would make on that is on this notion of the moral compass, and Brian alluded to this. Every decision that one makes, there will always be detractors, and you have to explain the why, as Brian said. Take what is happening in Ukraine, Russia. We've made some decisions to be on the right side of history. I have detractors in my firm asking as to why we're not going faster or why we're not going a certain direction. So we have to be steadfast in explaining as to why we made a particular decision, keeping true to our values and to our purpose.
So you mentioned Ukraine there. I mean, the current crisis in Ukraine feels very different to other geopolitical crises in the past, particularly how CEOs and companies are responding, and quite visually responding and actively making a point of responding. And responding to the public pressure to leave Russia. Can you share some more of your perspective on that, Punit?
Well, I think it's a very, first of all, it's a brutal aggression, and we're seeing it play out in a way that we haven't seen past aggressions. It's on the TV, at least in the United States, every day. It's on social media. My people are pinging me on a regular basis. And so again, we go back to our purpose and our values, and we believe that it is the right decision for us, even though painful, to exit Russia. 3,000 professionals, Deloitte professionals, call Russia home. So we have to take care of them. 600 of them are in Ukraine. So we're evacuating them and taking care of them as well. So it's been a very visible situation where CEOs have been called to make the right, as the professor was saying, moral decision. We've gone back to our values and purpose to try and be on the right side of history, even though it is not. It's going to be painful in the short term economically.
And do you think it's fair to classify, and this is a question to all the panelists, classify that kind of significant business decision, which, as you say, can be quite painful, as a way of protecting the reputation of the organization in the future? Is that part of the decision?
Well, I can start, and then I'd like to hear from Brian and others, but I absolutely. I know that it is important to many of our clients, though we still have to serve our clients, multinational clients that still have, as an example, we've got audits to finish of multinationals that were operating in Russia, even if they've pulled out. So that activity we have professional obligations that we have to meet as we exit Russia. But to meet the expectations of my employees, my practitioners, 350,000 of them, it influences the decision.
I was in Washington last week with President Biden and various members of the administration, addressed a couple different groups of us, and it was interesting phenomena where they're thanking the business community for acting quickly and taking action. So we got to enforce the sanctions, and there's for financial services firm, there's a very detailed set of things you have to do, and that we've been doing that for years in all different types of situations. But above that, the position administration was the the business community, has moved, and by moving, that helps them, establish the, the policy positions they wanted to have, and that's what's going on. And it's sometimes, as Punit said, he's got a lot of professionals there and has to finish the audits because these people have to close their books, and there's things like that I think sometimes people have to understand some pragmatism. But the good news is, I think the business community has done what it's done. The administration and backing the administration's goal in the political side, same in Europe too. I just happen to be American CEOs because it's a business roundtable, which is an American CEO group. So it'd be the same if we were with a European CEO group. But it's a lot. It's a lot of work in a very difficult situation, and we're trying to help society get do what it needs to do, and the communities do what they need to do to help society get to the purpose it wants, and administration in our case.
And CEOs, as they increasingly become a moral compass, as we talked about, for organizations, there's a need for the values of a CEO to align with the values of an organization, and that can have an impact in the selection process for a CEO. But also, I'm curious to hear, Helen, your perspective on what the role of the CMO is in that arrangement, and what can CMOs do to encourage their CEOs to stay true to the values of their brand, and also to financially invest in the brand in the long term. And I'm keen to hear if you have any examples of where you think that's worked really well in real life.
I mean, I think the truth is that the CMO are the same three letters, but the role can be very, very different across organizations. But I think, it's sort of an obvious point, really, isn't it? That, if you want to encourage your CEO to invest in your brand, you've got to make the business case for that. And you've got to have the data and the econometrics to be able to do that. So I think that's really important. I think where I've seen, I was reflecting on this earlier, I think where I've seen good CEO-CMO relationships are where they're, and that's me observing, so if I take the example of CVS Healthcare and Norman de Greve, he told a story a few years ago of how he, convinced the board to take cigarettes out of CVS as part of their commitment to their purpose around better health. And at the ANA conference, he talked about it being a battle to do that. But in the end, he had the stature and the trust within his senior leadership team that they went with him on it. And I think that's unusual, actually. So I think when the CMO has got stature, trust among the leadership team, that's when the relationships are working really well and really hard. And it's not often you see a CMO making it to CEO. I mean, I was working with one last week, Cheryl Calverley, who's CEO of Eve Sleep, which is a direct consumer startup, but she made it from CMO to CEO. And we probably don't see that often enough, actually.
I mean, historically, organizationally, Anne Finucane, who recently retired after many, many years for the company, she had not only the classic marketing, but she had government relations, and she had ESG work, and she had philanthropy. And so, the holistic approach, that Anne and her team and now her successors and the team she's left behind have put together, which is, it goes to things like in the arts. So you'd say, what's the arts got to do with a lot of this? Is that one of the approaches we take in the arts for many years is a thing called Museums on Us, which gives free admission to people who have a Bank of America card on the first month across 90-some markets. The obviously museums like it just drives up viewership, but the reality is it's access that would have never been had, right? And so, and how we approach the arts and the exhibits we sponsor around the world with bringing kids in to see it, and that would not necessarily be exposed. So, not to say that that's beyond, but it takes that kind of approach of how to think about even things that are core sponsorship and what you do and how it relates to building a better society behind it. And as the great Winston Churchill was said to say, which I don't know if is true, because many things he said are attributed to him, is when in the middle of the World War II, when they were bombing London, and he asked to preserve the arts funding, and they said, why would we do that? We need everything to go to war. And he said, well, without funding the arts, what are we going to war for? And so I think we have to remember that the way you use the whole marketing strategy and integration strategy is around this question of promoting who you are as a company, i.e. the brand, and then why that brand is trustworthy, but also accomplishing purposes, which then you can look back as to make your company a company of opportunity and create opportunity in society.
One other thing that I would add is when you talk about a brand and what comprises the brand, the purpose, the actions have to lead to a direct link to the brand with tangible outcomes. What do I mean by that? I mean, our purpose is to make an impact that matters for our clients, for our people, and for the communities that we live and work in. For our people, a key element is taking care of our people. So let's look at Ukraine, Russia. We have 3,000 people in Ukraine and Russia. We talk about taking care of our people. We have to then manifest that in tangible ways and demonstrate it to our people outside of Russia and Ukraine that we're actually living our purpose and living our brand. And that is really important. My communications over the last 30 some days have been overwhelmingly around providing evidence to our partners and to our people in terms of what we are doing for the 600 individuals that call Ukraine home. We've rescued 167 of them out of Ukraine. For the people, the 18 to 60-year-old that are men particularly, but women as well, that have taken up arms to defend their homeland. What is it that we're doing? Very tangible steps. That is important as well.
Yeah, I was just going to add, I think this point about, having a purpose that sounds lovely is one thing. Actually delivering on it and showing that you've delivered on it in a very tangible way is really important, which is why I was so impressed by that CVS story, because he convinced them to take cigarettes out of all of the 7,000 CVS stores, which was just incredible and worth 2 billion of revenue. I mean, they made the revenue back, but they dropped it immediately. But they had to do that because their purpose was about helping people to better health. How can you do that and sell cigarettes? So they had to do that.
I think if I can add to this also is that, the question whether the values are the values of the CEO or the CMO, actually the values need to be really shared across the whole organization. So if we are going to say that we are helpful and, we love our customers, people need to feel that love when they call into a call center, when they go into a retail store. So everyone across the organization from the top downwards need to live these values. So if we say we are about technology and enablement, you have to walk into a store and you feel technology everywhere there. If you say you're technology and people walk and it looks like, a service center from the 80s, that doesn't really deliver on the values that are shared across the organization. If we say that we are, going to be customer-centric, and then we always try to prove that the customer is wrong, that doesn't work. Even if the CEO says we're customer-centric, it has to trickle down all the way to the customer-facing stuff. So I think that it's very important that these values are not just the CEO values or the CMO values, but the set of values that an organization have to be really shared all across and being reinforced all the time, not only verbally or in communication, but even in annual appraisals and so on. People need to be appraised, need to be measured, not only on the hard numbers, but also on how they live the values of the brand.
Well, 2 quick points on that. One, I want to build on what Brian said initially, consistency. We are in 150 countries. And those countries range from, of course, the West, which lives with a certain set of norms and values, and then also countries that don't. And what we have to insist on is that we live by Deloitte values consistently. We're not influenced by what happens in a particular society, particularly around corruption. We're an ethical organization. There's a level of consistency. That's point one. The second point that was being made just now was, what happens when somebody doesn't live the values? What actions will you take, particularly for senior leaders? And then will you inform the organization that you've taken those actions? Those are very important to do as well, particularly in an organization like ours that doesn't produce a product. Our brand is the most valuable thing that we have.
It's interesting. In some of the earlier lead-in, Annie and Helen would reflect on this. You were talking, in some of the examples, you were talking about founders, and remember, our company's 238 years old. So unless there's a new pill that comes out that can make me live a lot longer, there is a duration of which, the management team and the team I have today will touch this company, and tomorrow is my 30th anniversary of the company, so it's been a long time. But the reality is, it's moments. It's a drop in a bucket of water across a company that's got this kind of length to it and expects to have this length forever. And so the question you have to ask yourself is the durability, and the stewardship is the right word, because at the end of the day, even a founder-led company doesn't become a founder-led company. And so think of some of the companies on your list, and in terms of the Microsofts or Apples, they were at one point and they aren't anymore because they're big, enterprise with multi changeovers and management and things in the past. So I think, so we're all stewards, and that stewardship then means you have to think about consistency and durability, and the brands have to be the values have to be the values of the company, and they have to ring true. They have to ring true with people with 50-year careers, that they can see it across their career, that we haven't, oh, this is the flavor of the month, let's do this, tomorrow that. It has to, and that is hard, and especially when you're making acquisitions and larger companies start doing that. And our company is a product of thousands of companies being rolled into it, and even in the last 20 years, I came in through an acquisition about 20 years ago. You think about 7 acquisitions, 300,000 new teammates coming in, and we only have 200,000 today. So think about all the change, and having that consistency, which goes way beyond the CMO, goes way beyond the CEO, and goes to the heart of what the company will stand for across time, is critical. Otherwise, it'll just keep getting flipped over every 6 months. It may be expressed differently. People may have different words, but it has to be something that has durability. Otherwise it just becomes a whipsawing, and you see that in some companies. They start to play around with it, and then it's like every day the people wake up and say, "What are we going to do today?" And you don't need that. You need a durability to it.
I was just going to add, I think a really good example of that is Johnson & Johnson, who I work with, and they have their credo, and everybody within that organization knows what the credo is. And, it literally is on stone in one of their buildings. And I think it served them so well through very difficult times, times when Tylenol was poisoned with cyanide, and they got it all off the shelf. I think that the credo served them well.
And Brian, you're talking about how obviously no CEO can be in control of an organization forever. And in a sense, the brand can be the legacy left by founder CEOs, and particularly CEOs who are there for a long time, like yourself. Congratulations on your 30th anniversary tomorrow. So how do you see investing in the brand and reputation? What's your view on that in the long run? I mean, it's something that I know isn't always prioritized in the short run in favor of what's sometimes seen as quicker wins, lower hanging fruit. But perhaps Brian and Punit and Hatem, you could comment on your experience of that, and how investing in the brand and reputation in the long term is prioritized in your organizations, and what are some of the benefits that you expect from that?
So, like any CEO, the people who run our marketing team would tell me we never spend enough on marketing, but that's a part of the investment in the brand actually really goes to the discussion Adam had, which is it is how you approach every customer interaction. And so we have 1 billion customer interactions a month. And so, every one of those, as I always say, the brand's sitting on the shoulder of both a digital interaction, a personal interaction, and every interaction. So it's how you get embedded in the brand and client experience, from the relationship management businesses covering companies to the consumer businesses, and how they express it, and how they're consistent, and how they keep trying to improve that. That out of that arises the brand. And so, yes, we spend a couple $2 billion a year on what most people think is marketing, but the reality is we spend $30-odd billion a year on our people, which carry the brand, and we spend $3 billion on new technology development per year, which helps improve that customer interface capability. So I think it's a much more holistic discussion than the marketing. But you've got to, and then how people recognize who you are and what you do, and the positions you take and why. And you talk about tough decisions at CVS. We made the decision 2009 or 10 to give up $4 billion a year in revenue and overdrafts. And there's a lot of talk about what we're doing today, but that was 5 billion to 1 billion, and we're going from 1 billion to 200 million today, and everybody's talking about that. Guess what hurt more, and it was just a decision. We're just going to change the way and change the whole business model. And there's been decisions all along. We decided not to play in. We were 20-some% of the mortgage market. Now we're 5%. You'd say, geez, what kind of unsuccessful CEO could do that, but we're all direct to the consumers, and we look the person in the eye and make the mortgage loan to them and stand by it. So you can make decisions how the business works to enhance the brand. And our brand is an all-time high right now, believe it or not, and even through the pandemic and everything. So I think the question of, really, Hatem said, every single touch, every single interaction, every single store, every single person walking into Punit's office to talk to him about, strategic questions or financing for Deloitte, every one of those is a brand interaction. And we have to have our teammates seriously recognize that. And that is the hardest job as a CEO, is to get to be that absolute perfect consistency that you strive for in every interaction. And believe me, we have bumps in the night and everything that you overcome. But if you've been so consistent, a bump occurs, people are like, fine. And if you fix that bump, they're 100% with you. So the question is, keep the bumps down, then respond to them, but have a trust and a belief factor before you get to that bump that people are going to side with you as opposed to side the other side. And that's how you run the whole enterprise for years building up.
Follow on what Brian said, I think in the past, 20, 30 years ago, investing in a brand was a lot through getting the product right and advertising. And this used to be everything. I mean, again, before the last 20, some 30 years ago, beginning of my career, I was in FMCG, and the whole thing was about product and advertising, and that's how you build brands. Now it's a lot more about the experience, and also about managing segments of customers that can be as small as one customer, because one disgruntled customer today can go on social media and cause so much damage to the brand. So we have to really pay attention now to the individual experiences that customers have. In the past, it used to be, people need to have access to go and speak, have a problem big enough to speak on TV to damage your brand, or go and have an interview in a newspaper. And normally people didn't have that big of a problem, except in very few cases. But today, a customer that has an issue with, his billing, a customer that has an issue with his device, and customer that has an issue, in the case of Brian, with his account, he will go on social media and start talking about it, influencing a lot of other people. We have customers that are influencers that have a lot of reach directly, sometimes more than actually what we reach customers with advertising, or customers that can end up getting the attention of an influencer, and the whole thing gets out of proportion. So the investment of a brand is becoming now more different than before, because not only do we invest in projecting an image, we have to really invest in the whole experience, and also invest in the dialogue with the customers, because we need to make sure that if somebody's unhappy, we can solve their issue, see how we can make them happy, how they can believe our brand story again. Because if you start having enough people that do not believe and subscribe to the brand story you have, you end up losing a lot of the investment you're doing in the other parts of the business. So the world and the whole way a brand projects has really been changing over the last decade.
And we're probably going to get on to our last question now, which is one that's been provided through the Q&A. So thank you to the audience. And as promised earlier, if we could launch that poll, please, Zoe, to hear from the audience their opinion on a few topics, and we'll just run that in the background while we continue the poll. But the question that's come through from the audience, which is a great one, is what have been your experience of helping to make your employees brand advocates? And this is, again, a marketing tool that's becoming increasingly important. And as you're saying, Hatem, the face of advertising is changing. So what role can the CEO play in this, in encouraging staff to be brand advocates, and what has or hasn't worked? Perhaps, Punit, you could start us off.
We made a commitment to be net zero by 2030. And we've taken multiple steps. Certainly, we're going to limit our travel. Travel is the biggest component of our contribution to CO2. So we're going to limit that. We're going to look at the buildings. We have 900 offices and trying to make them energy efficient. But what we found, the most impactful thing that we can do is involve our 350,000 professionals and give them the tools so that they can understand as to how they can contribute to our goal of net zero, and how they can then influence the rest in their communities to become better stewards of climate. I think it's been a great way to engage our people. It's a way to get them consistent with our brand, and it also demonstrates that we are living our purpose and our brand through our people.
I think just to come at that a little differently, the question was, how do you create employees? It is obvious that the employees that are working in our branches and stores, the call center teammates, because they're talking to clients all the time, the relationship teammates in the commercial businesses. The question is when you add that all up, you still have about 60% of people in the operations groups or in technology groups or risk and audit. And so, one of the things is we have developed what we call Deliver One Company, which actually has by our 90 odd markets in the US, keeps track of all the referrals, and we made it very easy for employees to refer brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, people, cocktail parties into the company. And we started from problem solving. We gave them access to this problem solving. So if somebody came to me and said, I have an issue, there's a group that solves those issues, obviously, because by the time they bubble up, there's quite a lot of energy around them, let's just say that. And so that, so we said to the employees, look, if you ever have a problem, report it in. And then we started saying to them, and by the way, refer people in. And so what you created across that group is a ownership in that they can do it. And all the markets are scored on, have a goal to deliver one company, which by the non-client facing people, as we call it. And, they live up to it. We celebrate success. And nobody loses their job or gains their job on this. It's just a part of owning the company and realizing that your fortune is tied up to the brand and reputation of the company. The other thing we've done is effectively everybody in our company owns stock. We've been doing specialized bonus awards for people lower pay, but up to 97% of the people for the last few years. And we've given more and more stock in the last year, absent people part-time in some of the places that it didn't work. We gave stock to really 100-some thousand people for the first time, and we will continue to do that. You want them to understand the alignment of their activities with customers, the brand, and the economics of shareholders, and that piece is important. And so so we're constantly working at ways to tie it in, and part of it really to Hatem is the communication. At the end of the day, CEOs repeat themselves. This is my 13th year, and I say the same things I said 12 years ago. And it's amazing how many times you say it, but you have to remember that we have 11% turnover rate, which is really low given the environment. But that means a year later, 11% of people have never heard me say it potentially if they haven't. So you just need to repeat this basic thing we call responsible growth, which gets to the genius of the end and everything you're talking about in a balance and all that. But you got to repeat it. And so give them some tasks to do, give them some stake in the game. Tell them why and repeat it often, and then they will become advocates for the brand. Not that they weren't, but it'll just make them understand their role in being advocates for the brand.
I totally agree. Having that emphasis of communication and being consistent with the communication, having a narrative that is shared not only with the CEO, but with the entire management, it means basically the whole organization is singing to the same tune, and that narrative reaches the customers as well. So we have to always have that emphasis and focus on that common narrative, because one of the worst things I've seen is companies where what the CEO says and what the management says and what the staff say are really different, and that causes so much disparity and so much confusion. Having that common narrative creates engagement of the whole organization, and that creates the great customer experience and creates a great brand.
Excellent, thank you. And we are going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. I'm sure we could keep talking about this. David, would you like to make any closing remarks? I think probably got to say goodbye to our panel.
Well, I thought that was a tremendous conversation. And as we're very tight for time, all I wanted to say was a tremendous thank you to the three fantastic CEOs who've kindly given their time. The thing which strikes me of all three of you is you're all working for massive organizations that are of global stature, and yet you all seem very down to earth, which is probably why you're all extremely successful CEOs. And what I was going to say is that when we go through to our next wave of research, which will be starting sometime in the autumn probably, we're going to be looking into various other aspects of CEOs. It'd be interesting to have comments from the CEOs themselves, whether or not are there things that they want to know about brand and reputation management that we could research, because we're always trying to find out things that staff want to know so that they can talk to CEOs better and perform better for the CEOs. If there are things that we ought to be researching, let us know. We'll put it into the hopper and see what we can do for next year. Once again, thank you very much. It was a tremendous conversation.